Hello, everyone. This is not just a story. This is a memory someone might be living right now. If this touches you, please like the video and subscribe. Share your city and the hour you're watching this. Let's remind each other we are not invisible. Now turn off the lights, find a quiet space, and let's begin. The ballroom smelled faintly of orchids and over-polished floors. Strings played in the distance, and laughter hummed through champagne glasses. But none of that mattered the moment I picked up my name tag. It wasn't mine. Not really. The old lady who's paying for everything. That's what it said, etched in cursive gold tucked neatly into a plastic sleeve, like a label on an object, not a person. My breath caught in my throat. The young woman at the check-in desk smiled, oblivious. "Isn't it funny?" she said, handing it to me like a joke at a dinner party. I nodded politely, my fingers trembling, the corners of my mouth twitching to stay civil. I pinned it to my pale blue dress anyway. Because that's what you do at your granddaughter's wedding. You smile, you sit down, you swallow the bitter before the meal. I found my seat table 7, far from the family table, yet close enough to see them laughing, to see Richard's confident grin, and Pamela's shimmering dress that whispered wealth I had quietly paid for, and Jennifer radiant, oblivious, in love. I wanted to be happy. I wanted the scent of her bouquet to wash away the sting of that tag, but all I could smell was the years. Years of writing checks without asking for repayment. Years of nodding yes when I wanted to say no. Years of loving so hard that I had quietly disappeared into their convenience. A soft quote from a book my late husband once read to me came to mind. "They make a ghost of the giver when all they do is take." That evening, I became aware of something I had never dared to feel fully before I wasn't part of the celebration. I was the currency funding it, and suddenly I wasn't sure I wanted to pay anymore. The morning after the wedding, the house was still. I sat in my kitchen, the pale light of dawn casting soft shadows across the wooden table. My bathrobe was loosely tied and my hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm tea I'd forgotten to drink. In front of me, like a badge of shame, lay the name tag. It mocked me in silence. The old lady who's paying for everything. I traced each letter with my finger, not quite touching, as if it might sting. That elegant calligraphy, they had spared no expense on that detail. How poetic! Even my humiliation had been dressed up. I looked around my kitchen. The fridge magnet from Jennifer's middle school graduation. The faint scratch in the wooden countertop where Richard dropped a heavy casserole dish 20 years ago. The faded family portrait on the wall, slightly crooked. I had built this life with Robert. Every memory, every corner of this home had his fingerprint, his steady hands, his quiet presence. His voice, now only alive in my mind, had always brought balance. When the world spun too fast, you see people for who they are. He once said to me, "Not how they treat you. That's your gift and your wound." The house creaked gently as if responding. I moved to the living room, drawn to the fireplace where the family portrait still hung. 5 years ago, taken on our 40th wedding anniversary. Robert in the center, still strong, though illness had begun to whisper behind his eyes. Me beside him, hand on his shoulder. Richard, Pamela, Jennifer, and Michael framed around us like the family we once were. But something had shifted. Maybe it was always there. Maybe grief had been a curtain that shielded me from truth. Or maybe I had chosen blindness because it hurt less than knowing. A memory surfaced uninvited. 6 months after Robert's funeral. Richard and Pamela had invited me to dinner, warm, gentle, uncharacteristically kind. "We've been thinking about redoing our kitchen," Pamela had said, sipping wine she didn't like but thought looked sophisticated. "New countertops." Richard added nothing major. I had smiled and written a check before dessert. That was the beginning. That was when I began to vanish into the walls of my own generosity. I opened the hallway closet, dragging out an old box filled with receipts, check stubs, and notes scribbled on envelopes. I sat on the floor cross-legged like a child sifting through proof of my own erasure. $30,000 for kitchen remodel, $50,000 for college tuition, $12,000 for Jennifer's first car, $18,000 for Michael's 18th birthday trip, $45,000 for the wedding. The numbers blurred, but the pattern was clear. I wasn't being generous. I was being used. The phone rang, cutting through the silence like a blade. I stood slowly still, holding a faded invoice from a family trip to Cancun, one I had paid for but barely remembered enjoying. "Hello, Alice," Pamela's voice syrupy and sharp. "Yes, just wanted to say thank you again for everything yesterday. The wedding was magical. Yes, it was beautiful." There was a pause, calculated. "It's just that Mark's parents were supposed to pay for the honeymoon, but his father's business, well, it's complicated. Jennifer's devastated." I felt it coming like a storm before thunder. "We were wondering," she continued, soft as velvet, "if you might be willing to help. 2 weeks in Bali. You'd be making her dream come true." I closed my eyes. "I'll think about it." Silence. Not the response she expected. "Well, they need to book soon to get the best rate." "I understand. I'll let you know tomorrow." I hung up and stared at the box on the floor. Robert had once told me, money doesn't corrupt people, it reveals them. And now I was beginning to see. I wasn't a mother, I wasn't even a person. To them, I was a vault with a smile. The next knock on the door was different. Grandma Michael stood on the porch, hands in his pockets, eyes soft. He was always different. Quieter, less entitled. He looked so much like Robert at that age, it almost hurt. I wanted to say, "I'm sorry," he said. "For yesterday, the name tag, the jokes. It wasn't right. You noticed." "Of course. A lot of people did. I should have said something." I shook my head. "It's not your burden to carry. But I'm glad you came." As we sat together in the kitchen sharing a pot of tea that actually got drunk this time, I asked, "Do you think your parents have changed? Or were they always this way?" Michael hesitated. "Since Grandpa died, it's like all they see is your money. Last week I overheard them talking about this house, how it's too big for one person, about helping you downsize. Downsize. That word again. Neat. Practical. Merciless." I smiled at Michael, but inside something was breaking and rebuilding. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I think I'm seeing things clearly for the first time in a long while." We drank our tea in silence. Not the silence of absence, but of clarity. The first step toward reclaiming something I had forgotten. I still possessed my power. There's a kind of wound you can't see, not the ones that bleed or bruise, but the ones that slowly hollow you out until you no longer recognize the sound of your own voice when you speak. 3 days after the wedding, Richard and Pamela hosted a post-wedding brunch at their country club. I debated not going. Part of me wanted to stay home, tend to the roses in the back garden, and let the storm pass over me. But another part needed to see. I needed to know if what happened at the wedding had been a lapse or a pattern. I arrived dressed in a cream pantsuit Robert always said made me look regal. He had a fondness for that word. It was his quiet way of reminding me I came from dignity, even when the world forgot it. "Mom, over here," Richard waved, his voice booming. Pamela floated beside him, impeccable, in a designer dress that whispered wealth we all knew she didn't earn. They seated me near Mark's parents, strangers, really. Not beside Jennifer, not even near Michael. I was a guest again, a distant one. As I lifted my coffee, trying to remain gracious, Pamela tapped her glass. Everyone, she announced, her smile like porcelain. "We have a special thank you to make. To Grandma Alice, whose generosity made Jennifer and Mark's wedding unforgettable." All eyes turned to me. A blush crept up my neck. I nodded, managing a small smile. "And we have some exciting news," she continued. "Grandma will also be funding their dream honeymoon, Yatum to Bali." There was a smattering of applause. A few guests looked surprised. Jennifer's face flushed with uncertainty. Mark stared at his plate. I lowered my cup. I hadn't agreed to this. "This is the first I'm hearing of it," I said calmly. Pamela's smile flickered. Well, we discussed it yesterday. Remember, you said you'd think about it. Yes, and I'm still thinking. Richard leaned toward me, a forced smile on his lips, his whisper stage loud. Mom, don't make a scene. We've already told them they can book the trip. I felt it then. The snap, the breaking point. Years of silent sacrifice suddenly threadbare. I don't recall agreeing to pay for a honeymoon to Bali. I said, my voice steady carrying. In fact, I believe Mark's parents were originally planning to cover that expense. Mark's father shifted in his seat. There were some business setbacks, he muttered. I understand, I said gently. These things happen, but I think it's inappropriate to publicly volunteer someone else's money without their consent. Don't you? Silence rippled across the table like a dropped wine glass. Perhaps, I continued, Jennifer and Mark might consider a honeymoon more within their means. Pamela's face darkened. Within their means, she hissed. What about your means? Everyone knows Robert left you plenty. Why are you suddenly being so difficult? I looked at her, then really looked, and I saw not a daughter-in-law, not even family, but someone who had long mistaken kindness for obligation. My finances are not up for public discussion, I said, and neither are my spending choices. Richard's hand gripped my arm. Mom, stop it. You're embarrassing us, I pulled away. No, Richard. You've embarrassed yourselves. I stood smoothing my jacket, the same one I wore the day we buried Robert. Jennifer, Mark, I wish you both happiness. I would be happy to contribute to a reasonable honeymoon, but I will discuss that with you privately. Michael stood too. I'll walk you out, Grandma. We exited under a heavy silence. Behind us whispered confusion, awkward glances, and the smell of brunch turning sour. Outside, the air was fresh. Are you okay to drive? Michael asked. I nodded. Just a bit shaken. He smiled gently. You should be proud of yourself. That took courage. For the first time in years, I believed him. That night, we had dinner together, just roast chicken potatoes, a simple salad. I told him about everything. The loans, the demands, the slow drain of my autonomy. I'm not surprised, he said. After Grandpa died, it's like they stopped seeing you as a person. I nodded. They see me as an ATM, and now they want the house, he added. Last week, I heard Dad talking about a retirement home, Sunrise Acres. He said the market is hot and they could help you maximize your investment. It felt like ice pouring into my chest. My home, the last place that still belonged to me and Robert, the sanctuary of a life we built together, and now they wanted to cash it in. I looked at Michael, his face steady, kind, strong. There's something I need to tell you, I said. But before I could continue, the doorbell rang. Richard's car was in the driveway. Michael's expression hardened. You don't have to answer. But I was done hiding. No, I said. It's time. The knock wasn't just loud, it was demanding. Richard had always walked through life that way, expecting doors to open before he reached them, expecting people, especially me, to accommodate, absorb, yield. When I opened the door, he didn't wait for an invitation. He pushed past me into the hallway like he still lived here. What the hell was that performance at brunch? He spat, his voice echoing off walls that had once been filled with lullabies and Robert's laughter. Michael stood in the entryway, arms crossed. I'm having dinner with Grandma, he said calmly. Something you might try without bringing an invoice. Richard's eyes narrowed. Stay out of this. It's between your mother and me. No, I said. It's not. It's about this family, and Michael is part of it. Richard looked at me like I'd grown horns. You're being manipulated, he snapped. We've always looked out for you. We've helped you manage things since Dad passed. No, I said, voice quiet. You've helped yourselves to what Dad left. He paced like a man on trial. Because in a way he was. You're letting him poison you against us, he said, gesturing to Michael. You're turning your back on your own son. I sat down in Robert's old armchair, the one he read to our children from, the one that still carried the scent of leather and pipe smoke. No one is poisoning anything I said. We're simply calling things by their name, something I should have done years ago. Michael stepped closer. You've been treating Grandma like an account you can draw from not a person. The name tag, the Bali stunt, talking about selling her home behind her back. Richard flushed red. We're trying to help her make good decisions. I'm 65, not 95, I said, and I'm more than capable. Dad left you everything. He exploded. You're just going to hoard it. You're not even using half of it. Robert's voice came back to me then, words whispered in memory. Wealth is not what you keep, Alice. It's what you respect. You know what hurts most, I said. Not the money, not the assumptions, but the fact that you never once asked what I wanted, what I needed. You never saw me, Richard. Not really. He blinked, for once speechless. Then softer than I expected, he said, So what are you saying? You're cutting us off because of a name tag. I'm saying I replied that. From now on, I will be making my own decisions, with my money, with my home, with my life. There it was, the boundary, set not in anger, but in quiet clarity. He stared at me as if I'd slapped him, then turned to Michael. I want to speak to her alone. I'm staying, Michael said firmly. This is family business, exactly, he snapped. And I'm family too. Yes, Michael replied, which is why it's time you started acting like it. Richard left soon after muttering threats and disbelief. He said it wasn't over, that he'd fix this. But I had already begun fixing what truly mattered me. That night, I sat alone on the porch. The garden was still stars, blinking quietly above. I thought about Robert and the codicil Martin had given me, the secret clause in his will that said anyone who publicly humiliated me would be disinherited. I could have wielded it like a sword, but I didn't want obedience born of fear. I wanted the truth raw, unscripted, undeniable, and I had it now. What I didn't yet have was a plan, but the seed had been planted. And in the silence of that night, I began to water it. The next morning arrived like any other sunlight pooling through my kitchen window, the kettle hissing gently on the stove. The scent of chamomile and rosemary wafting from the garden, I had finally begun tending again. But something was different. Not outside, inside me. I was no longer walking around wounds I didn't name. I had begun stitching them in silence. There was no declaration, no drama, just small, deliberate acts of reclamation. That afternoon, I called Martin Reynolds. Martin, I said, my voice steady. I want to understand everything Robert left behind, not just the codicil, but the full picture. A pause. Then his warm, calm tone replied, Come by the office at 3. Bring nothing but time. When I entered his office a few hours later, he looked up from behind his desk and stood. Before we begin, he said, placing a folder before me, I want to tell you something Robert once said 2 weeks before he passed. He opened the folder, revealing a sheet of paper with his neat handwriting. He said, If Alice ever doubts herself, remind her she built this family long before I made any fortune. The estate exists because of her sacrifices, not just my strategies. I closed my eyes, the sting behind them blooming like bruised petals. He never wanted you to carry this burden alone, Martin added. The documents inside confirmed what I had long suspected, but never truly grasped. Robert had been more successful than I knew. Investments, business shares, property holdings, he had quietly grown a fortune while we lived, simply. He had trusted me to carry it, not to spend, but to steward. But more importantly, he had trusted me to protect myself when the time came. That time had arrived. At home, I didn't announce my decisions. I didn't argue. I didn't confront. I simply began choosing. That evening, I called Eleanor, an old friend I had grown distant from after Robert's passing. We laughed tentatively as if dusting off old instruments. Lunch was set for Friday. Next, I drove to the community center, picked up a brochure, Watercolor Painting for Beginners. Robert used to tease that I had the soul of a poet but the hands of a surgeon. I'd never let myself try, now I would. At home, I stood before the mirror brushing out my silver hair. And for the first time in years, I didn't wonder what Richard or Pamela would say about how I looked. I wondered what I wanted to see. The next call came from Pamela. I let it ring. The voicemail, when I finally listened, was what I expected. Alice, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Richard told me what you said. We should really have dinner this weekend, clear the air. Oh, and Jennifer mentioned you were reconsidering the honeymoon. They really need to book soon to get the best rates. Call me back. I didn't. Instead, I sat down and wrote a card. A wedding gift for Jennifer and Mark, a modest check for a honeymoon in Cape Cod, not Bali. Enough for comfort, not luxury. Inside, I wrote, "May your marriage be rich in kindness, not currency. Love, Grandma." I sealed the envelope, slipped it into the mailbox. No dramatic scenes, just quiet redirection. Over the next week, I made more changes. I reorganized the kitchen cabinets, cleared out the guest room, signed up for a senior travel group planning a weekend trip to Vermont. Michael came by one evening with a bookstore proposal, a dream he'd held quietly for years. "I don't know if it's realistic," he said. "Banks won't touch something like this. It's not exactly scalable." I took the folder from his hands. "You don't need scalability," I said. "You need soul. And shelves." He smiled. "I can help," I added. "Not as your bank, as your investor." His eyes widened, and for a moment I saw Robert in him again. His courage, his hope, his belief in creating something meaningful. He nodded slowly. "You believe in me, I always have, even when you didn't yet." That night, as I sat by the fireplace with a blanket and an old book, I realized something. Silence, when chosen, not imposed, is not weakness. It is strength at rest. It holds its shape. It prepares the ground. And soon it was ready to bloom. Some people make their declarations in boardrooms or over family dinners or during explosive confrontations. I made mine in brushstrokes, in the community center's bright art studio surrounded by jars of rinsed paint water and the hum of elderly beginners rediscovering joy. I dipped a sable brush into aquamarine and let it bloom across paper. A seascape emerged untrained but alive. The instructor, a woman with white hair and a fierce lipstick shade, peered over my shoulder. "You're painting memory," she said softly. I smiled. Maybe I'm painting what I forgot to remember. At home, I reorganized more than shelves. I redrafted my will with Martin's help. "I want to create a living trust," I told him, "one that reflects the truth, not just the law." He nodded. "Are you certain you want to proceed quietly? You have every right to enforce the codicil now." "Yes," I said, "but I need to see their hearts without threat hanging over them. And if they never change, then I'll have my answer." We crafted it carefully, a trust with stipulations rooted not in control, but in character. Regular reviews, evidence of relationship, not requests, love, not leverage. Michael's name was added not just as beneficiary, but as a collaborator. We discussed his bookstore vision in depth, even met with a young business coach from the community's entrepreneurship center. He was ready, and so was I. Meanwhile, Richard and Pamela's silence grew longer, but not empty. It festered. Pamela's texts trickled in first shallow updates about Jennifer's new curtains, Mark's job promotion, her own exhaustion from planning the wedding. Then, like clockwork, the ask. "Jennifer and Mark are thinking of putting down a deposit on a small starter home. Just $80,000 needed up front. Maybe you could surprise them." No greeting. No inquiry about my days or health. Just expectation dressed in thinly veiled charm. I didn't reply. Instead, I scheduled lunch with Eleanor again. We met at a quiet cafe we used to love. "You've changed," she said, stirring her tea. "Not hardened, just clarified." I told her everything. About the wedding, the tag, the clause in Robert's will, about how silence when purposeful isn't absence, it's armor. You're not hiding, she said. You're waiting. That's strategy. We laughed. Two women who had once given up dreams for diapers and dinner tables, now sharing war stories like soldiers of motherhood. Back at home, I stood in my garden and replanted the corner bed near the fence. It had been overtaken with weeds, years of neglect under the weight of everyone else's needs. Now I pressed bulbs into fresh soil, lavender, marigold, foxglove, delicate, stubborn, beautiful. Michael arrived with a folder under his arm. I found a space downtown. It's old, but charming. Needs work. He laid the blueprint across my kitchen table. I studied the hand-sketched floor plan, imagining it filled with warm wood books, stacked like treasure children curled into corners reading stories that might save them someday. I'll front the first phase, I said. He blinked. Are you sure I'm done waiting for permission to use my own life the way I want? He smiled slowly as if something in the world had just become right again. One night, the phone rang. It was Richard. No pleasantries, no warmth. I heard from Jennifer that you're investing in Michael's bookstore. I didn't respond. He continued tone sharp. And you're ignoring our messages. You know, Mom, this is starting to feel personal. It is, I said. What's that supposed to mean? It means I'm spending my time and money on people who see me not just what I can give. There was silence. Then, so what, you're punishing us? No, Richard. I'm choosing me. He hung up. I didn't flinch. Late that night, I sat at my desk and opened the drawer where Robert kept his watch. Inside, I found an old note, faded, tucked into the back, written in his precise script. If they forget who you are, remind them not with noise, but with grace that doesn't beg. I touched the ink with 2 fingers. I wasn't going to confront them. I was going to outgrow them. And soon they would see not who I had become, but who I had been all along. My 66th birthday arrived on a rain-washed Sunday in early spring. Michael had insisted on organizing a small gathering at my home. Just family, he said, and a few people who actually deserved to be called that. I'd protested at first, then I'd agreed, because something in me wanted them to see it, what I had rebuilt quietly when they weren't watching. That morning, I put on a red dress I never would have worn a year ago. Bold, certain. I'd learned how to style my hair through a workshop at the community center. Light makeup, soft shimmer on the cheeks. I looked in the mirror and smiled, not for Robert, not for Richard, not for anyone else. For me. Guests arrived one by one. Michael came first, as always, with a cheese platter and that nervous energy of someone hosting from the heart. Then Eleanor, with her sharp wit and a bouquet of sunflowers. Then Martin Reynolds, Robert's attorney, carrying a bottle of wine and something quiet in his eyes, like he already knew this night might change everything. Finally, Richard and Pamela arrived. Their smiles were tight, manufactured. She wore pearls. He carried flowers with the plastic price tag still dangling from the stem. You look different, Pamela said, eyes scanning the room. Have you redecorated? A few updates, I said. Been taking painting classes. I gestured to a canvas over the fireplace, a landscape I'd painted of a solitary cottage by the sea. Pamela's brow furrowed. Did you sell one of your paintings? 2, actually, Michael answered before I could speak. At the community art fair. Grandma's kind of a local celebrity now. Pamela's mouth opened, then closed. Dinner was served. Laughter bubbled from the guests who weren't pretending to care. The house felt fuller than it had in years, not with bodies, but with truth. After the meal, as I sliced a homemade lemon cake, Richard cleared his throat. There's something Pamela and I would like to bring up. The table quieted. He stood. We've been concerned, he began, about some of Mom's recent decisions. Pamela nodded. They've been unwise. Financially speaking, investing in a failing industry, isolating from family. Martin set down his fork carefully. "What are you suggesting?" he asked. "We think it's time to consider a power of attorney," Richard said, "just to ensure things are managed responsibly." I didn't move. Martin raised an eyebrow. "That's a serious request. Do you have evidence of diminished capacity she's giving away money for pipe dreams?" Richard argued, "and refusing to downsize, which is clearly in everyone's best interest." Pamela chimed in. "She won't even discuss selling this place. It's irrational. Silence. Not fearful. Not confused. Sharp. Measured. Powerful." I placed the cake knife on the table, wiped my hands on a cloth napkin, and stood slowly. "I am not irrational. I am not incapacitated. I am not your problem to manage, Mom." "No, Richard. I've been reasonable. For years, I paid for your renovations, your trips, your celebrations. But that season is over." He flushed. "This is about punishing us. This is about reclaiming myself." Pamela's voice turned desperate. "We were trying to help you." "No," I said. "You were trying to manage me out of convenience." Richard slammed his hand on the table. "After everything we've done for you." "You mean everything I've done for you," I said calmly. "You've taken and taken. Never asked who I was beneath the wallet." Then Martin cleared his throat, and the room fell into absolute stillness. "There's something everyone here should know," he said, rising. Richard's eyes narrowed. "What are you doing?" "Your father," Martin said, looking at me with a silent nod, "included a special clause in his will before he passed. A codicil, designed to protect Alice." Pamela laughed nervously. "A what?" Martin's voice didn't waver. "Any descendant who publicly humiliates Alice, attempts to control her finances, or tries to force her from her home forfeits their inheritance." Richard's face went pale. Pamela whispered, "That can't be real." "It's real," Martin said, "and I've been documenting every relevant incident." He turned to me. "Alice, do you want to enforce the codicil?" All eyes turned to me. I looked at Richard, at Pamela, at their fear not of loss but of no longer being able to take, then at Michael, steady, steadfast. I nodded. "Yes, I do." Richard sank into his chair. "You can't be serious. I've never been more serious." Pamela's hands trembled. "What about Jennifer?" "She didn't do anything." Martin consulted his notes. Jennifer was present at incidents but did not participate directly. Her share remains, though reduced. The majority now goes to Alice and to the descendant who has shown her care. Everyone looked at Michael. He looked shocked. I didn't know he said quietly, "Grandma." I swear I had no idea about any of this. "I know," I said. "That's why you deserve it." Richard stood suddenly. "This is manipulation. You've tricked us." "No," I replied. "I let you show yourselves. And now I'm simply stepping out of the shadow." The evening ended in fragments. Jennifer and Mark left first quiet apologies on their lips. Richard and Pamela stormed out, slamming the door behind them like angry children denied a toy. The others said their goodbyes with quiet reverence, like they'd witnessed something sacred. Michael stayed behind to help with dishes. "You okay?" he asked, drying a plate. "I feel," I said, "free." Outside, the garden swayed gently in the breeze. Inside, something stronger was blooming. Not revenge, not even justice. Something rarer. Dignity restored. 6 months passed, not with storms or shouts, but with small sacred reclamations. The house, once echoing with obligation, now hummed with soft laughter, with the rustle of pages turning in sunlit corners, with the scent of oil paints and fresh rosemary. I had begun painting weekly landscapes, flowers, the occasional abstract swirl when my emotions didn't want to be literal. I'd even sold 3 more pieces at the local art fair. Not for the money, for the joy of being seen by strangers, no less, not for what I gave, but for what I created. Richard and Pamela, for their part, had made their exit not gracefully, but definitively. After a series of threats to contest the will that fizzled under Martin's legal precision, they moved to Florida. Richard had taken a consulting job with an old associate. Their house in town was sold quietly. The for sale sign went up without a goodbye. They left behind a vacuum, and oddly peace. Pamela sent a Christmas card that year. It was stiff and printed from a template. Wishing you health and happiness in a font that tried too hard. Richard signed only his name. I didn't reply. Michael, on the other hand, became a constant. He visited often, sometimes with Emma, his steady, kind-hearted girlfriend, sometimes alone, carrying books he wanted to show me or updates on his bookstore project. Chapter 1 was coming to life. He'd found a Victorian house downtown with creaking floors and ivy-covered windows. We toured it together, stepping over dust and potential imagining what could be. "This will be the children's corner," he said once, pointing to a nook. "We'll hang fairy lights and tuck beanbags in here." And there, I added, gesturing to a wall, you could host poetry nights or story time. We stood side by side, dreamers building not castles, but a haven. The inheritance funds I'd transferred into his startup account came with no speeches, no demands, no guilt, just a note handwritten. For a future rooted in story, not strategy. Make it yours. Grandma. When the store opened 3 months later, it was everything I'd hoped for, and none of it was mine. That was the beauty of it. To give without being erased, to support without disappearing. He named the store Chapter 1. Not for the books, he said, but for the life he was beginning. And the one you began again. He added quietly. Jennifer visited me one afternoon balancing a baby carrier on her hip. "Her name is Roberta," she said, blushing. "We call her Bobby." I looked down at the sleeping baby girl, wisps of dark hair curled around her tiny ears. "After your grandfather?" I asked. Jennifer nodded. "I didn't tell Mom and Dad. They wouldn't understand." She placed the carrier on the kitchen counter, safe and close. "I'm sorry, Grandma, for the name tag, for staying silent. I knew it was wrong." I took her hand. "We all stay silent when we're afraid," I said. "The question is, when do we start speaking up?" Jennifer's eyes welled. "I'm trying to be better. For her." I touched Bobby's soft hand. "Then you already are." Later, as I sat with Martin over tea reviewing the final trust documents, he looked at me with quiet satisfaction. "Robert would be proud of you." I smiled. I finally stopped asking who I was to them. I started asking who I was to me. He raised his cup. "To the woman who stayed, and then chose herself anyway." I laughed. It only took 66 years. And a name tag. I nodded, eyes misting. Funny how the things meant to belittle us wake us up instead. As spring melted into summer, the bookstore thrived. Children curled into reading nooks. Adults sipped espresso while paging through novels. Emma hosted poetry readings. Michael ran writing workshops. He'd even created a small apartment upstairs, a residency for young writers. The first was a quiet woman from Oregon who wrote short stories about women growing old without fading. I liked her immediately. Jennifer and Mark visited often now. Their apologies had become actions, checking in, inviting me to dinner, letting me hold Bobby just because I wanted to. I still kept boundaries, not walls, just doorways I had the right to close. Pamela called once more, left a voicemail I never returned. "I think we could reconnect," she'd said. "Start fresh. We're family after all." No, we weren't. Not in the way that mattered. One evening after closing time, I stood alone in Chapter 1, staring at a painting I donated to the children's section, a forest scene, whimsical, full of hidden fairy doors and creatures peeking behind trees. A girl stood before it, maybe 6 years old. She tugged at my sleeve. "Did you make that I did?" She stared in awe. "It's magic." I knelt beside her. "So are you." And just like that, I understood something. The legacy Robert left me wasn't money. It was the ability to choose what mattered. And I had. Finally. There are moments that mark a life not with noise, but with quiet clarity. I woke one morning to birdsong outside my bedroom window. It had been a year since Jennifer's wedding, a year since I first pinned that cruel name tag to my chest, a year since I felt erased in a room full of people I loved, and yet now I stood in the same house, but a different woman. Not new, just returned. Returned to the parts of myself I'd buried beneath politeness and guilt. Richard and Pamela had gone silent again. After their final attempt to contest the codicil failed in court, they slipped away to Florida permanently. I heard from them only through Jennifer. Updates came like ripples from a far-off storm. Richard's job was a step down. Pamela missed the country club. Their new house was smaller than they'd wanted. They still don't understand why you did it, Jennifer said once hesitantly during tea. They think you let a lawyer and a clause tear the family apart. I stirred my cup gently. No, I said. I let truth do that. Jennifer looked down at her lap. Do you regret it? I reached across the table and took her hand. I regret what I tolerated, not what I ended. She nodded slowly, tears forming. I see it now. I do. The real surprise was Mark. He reached out a few months after the fallout, invited me to lunch. Just him. He'd seen what the wedding had cost me, he said. Not just money, but dignity. I was quiet when I should have spoken up, he confessed. I want to change that for Jennifer. For Bobby. We talked for an hour. About accountability. About the long shadows of silence. I left that lunch lighter than I arrived. Sometimes the apology doesn't come from the one who wronged you, but from the one who saw it and decided to be better. Meanwhile, Chapter 1 blossomed. The bookstore had become more than a business. It was a sanctuary. Children curled up on beanbags tracing words with tiny fingers. Teens whispered dreams between shelves. Elders like me gathered for tea and memoir readings. I led painting workshops once a month. I even sold prints now, nothing extravagant, just pieces that meant something to someone. One, a landscape of the sea at dusk, hung in the cafe. A young couple had offered to buy it, but I'd declined. That one, I told Emma, is for staying. Michael had grown into a man before my eyes, confident, still humble, and fiercely protective of the community he was building. He rarely mentioned his father, but I saw the quiet ache sometimes when an older man walked in with his grandson, or when a father read to his child in the children's corner. I wish he'd been different, he said once, arranging a new display. For you, for me, for all of us. He still could be, I offered, but that's not your job to fix. He smiled softly. I know. Thanks to you. One quiet afternoon, I stood in my garden gloves on knees in the soil when I heard footsteps behind me. It was Jennifer and Bobby. They came often now, not to ask for anything but to be with me, to remember where love once lived and could live again. Grandma Jennifer said, holding out a small box, "We have something for you." Inside a locket, engraved with, "Not the old lady, the strong one." I blinked back tears. Bobby reached for me, arms open, and I lifted her to my hip. Do you think she'll remember any of this? Jennifer asked, nodding toward her daughter. I looked into Bobby's wide, curious eyes. She'll remember what we rebuild, I said, not what we broke. That night, I pulled a blanket over my lap and settled into Robert's old armchair, my armchair now. I opened a journal I'd started keeping after the wedding. I wrote, "They called me old. They called me a bank. But never did they call me what I had always been, the keeper of stories, of sacrifices, of silence, until now." The house no longer felt haunted. It felt lived in by a woman who had finally come home to herself. It was a crisp autumn morning when I stood on the porch of Chapter 1, coffee in hand, watching the world move without rushing. Leaves scattered across the sidewalk like confetti left after a quiet celebration. Inside, Emma was arranging pastries. Michael was helping a boy pick out his first chapter book. The air smelled like cinnamon ink and promise. I had turned 67 2 weeks ago. No big party. Just a small dinner with people who understood me beyond what I gave. Eleanor brought wine and stories. Jennifer brought Bobby, now toddling and curious. Michael brought a hardcover journal with the words embossed on the cover for the next chapter. After everyone had gone that night, I sat in the quiet and reread the letter Robert had once left hidden in his desk, the one I hadn't found until after the codicil. It read, Alice, if you're reading this, you've had to stand alone. And I'm sorry, but I also know no one stands like you do, with grace, with grief, with the kind of silence that shapes mountains. Don't forget who you are, and don't ever let them shrink you. I folded the letter and placed it in a small box alongside the name tag that had started everything. I no longer kept it out of pain. I kept it as proof of how far I had come. Richard and Pamela never truly apologized, not in the way that heals. Their silence became their story. Occasionally, I heard about them through others. They'd adjusted, downsized, complained about the unfairness of legacy, but I no longer felt responsible for their disappointment. We all write our roles. They chose theirs, and I chose mine. That morning, as I watched the sunrise stretch across the bookstore windows, I thought of all the women I'd met through this journey. Widows, grandmothers, mothers, caretakers, givers. So many had whispered the same thing to me. I'm so tired of being everything and nothing at once. To them I say, you are not nothing. You are the foundation. You are the memory the house still carries, the scent in the baby blanket, the handprint in the wall paint, the wisdom in the quiet. And sometimes you are the storm that finally says enough. Bobby reached for me that day, her small fingers curled around mine. Story, Grandma, she asked, holding a book twice her size. Yes, sweetheart, I whispered, settling her into the reading corner. I began to read aloud, not just the words on the page, but the life I had chosen to reclaim, one soft syllable at a time. There comes a time in life when you stop asking who you are to others and start answering who you are to yourself, not through speeches or shouting, but in silence. In choosing who you spend your mornings with, in how you pour your tea, in what kind of story you choose to read to a child, in where you place your hands when the world tries to label you something smaller than you are. I used to be the old lady who paid for everything. Now I am the woman who chose what mattered. I chose love that didn't have conditions, family that didn't take more than it gave, peace over performance, and dignity over being liked. Sometimes healing doesn't come in the form of reconciliation. It comes in repainting a wall, in planting a lavender bed, in opening a door to a bookstore that smells of cedar and coffee. And most of all, it comes in the quiet you no longer fear because it is finally yours. So if you're listening to this sitting in a dim room wondering if your silence has power, it does. It always has. You are not invisible. You are not a burden. You are the beginning.